How to make the avoidant anxious about your absence. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship with someone who seems to pull away just when you're getting close? Someone who keeps you at arm's length, but the moment you step back, they start to feel the absence. The avoidant. You see, they thrive on their independence and fear being too close to others. But here's the secret. They do care. They do feel your absence. And that's where you hold the power. Let's face it, in relationships, whether personal or professional, we all want to feel important. We want to be missed. But sometimes it's not enough to simply be present. We need to create that emotional space, that gap, to make the avoidant realize what they truly have in us. The truth is, the avoidant's biggest fear is being too vulnerable. They want to keep their walls high. But deep inside, they crave the connection they try to distance themselves from. So the key to making them anxious about your absence is not to chase them, but to create a sense of scarcity. Make them realize that they might lose you. Make them see that your presence is not a guarantee. It's not about playing games. It's about recognizing the power of emotional distance and how, when used wisely, it can make them rethink their choices. It's about showing that while you respect their space, you're not willing to sacrifice your own needs for their comfort. You are valuable. Your time, your energy, your attention, these are gifts that shouldn't be taken for granted. When they feel that absence, when they experience the void left by your absence, it triggers something inside of them. They'll start to question whether their avoidance is worth it. And in that moment, you hold the power to shift the dynamic. You are no longer someone they can take for granted. You are someone they can't afford to lose. The avoidant personality type operates from a place of fear of emotional closeness, fear of vulnerability, and often a fear of losing their independence. This fear stems from past experiences, often rooted in childhood where emotional needs were either not met or were dismissed. As a result, the avoidant individual develops a defensive mechanism that pushes people away when they get too close, even if there is a deep internal desire for connection. The avoidant's fear of dependency is so powerful that they sometimes distance themselves from even the people they care about the most, thinking that emotional closeness will inevitably lead to rejection, suffocation, or emotional pain. Understanding this underlying fear is essential when trying to make the avoidant person anxious about your absence, because it allows you to approach the situation from a place of empathy and clarity rather than frustration or resentment. One key to understanding the avoidance behavior is recognizing that their emotional distance is not a reflection of a lack of care. Instead, it is often an unconscious reaction to the fear that closeness could bring with it a loss of control or a threat to their emotional stability. For the avoidant individual, their autonomy and independence are paramount. They may feel suffocated or overwhelmed by the intensity of emotional connection, and so they naturally push others away, not because they don't value the person, but because they fear becoming too emotionally dependent on them. When a person comes too close, the avoidant feels a vulnerability that they have learned to avoid, believing that if they allow someone too close, they will risk being hurt, betrayed, or disappointed. This emotional distance is their way of protecting themselves from perceived emotional harm, even if it means sacrificing intimacy or connection in the process. At the heart of the avoidance behavior is a deep-seated fear of being controlled or losing themselves in a relationship. They fear that emotional closeness will lead to dependence, which they see as a weakness. For many avoidants, the idea of losing their sense of self or being consumed by another person is far more frightening than the prospect of loneliness. As a result, they may act distant or indifferent, even though their heart and mind are often wrestling with the desire for closeness and intimacy. They want connection, but the fear of losing their independence or facing emotional overwhelm often leads them to shut down or retreat. In relationships, this fear manifests as a push-pull dynamic. The avoidant may allow small glimpses of closeness, but when the connection deepens, they will instinctively pull away. This often leaves their partner confused and frustrated, as the avoidance behavior can seem contradictory. One moment they may appear invested, and the next they retreat without warning. This withdrawal is not a sign of a lack of interest, but a defense mechanism to protect themselves from the emotional risk of getting too close. In fact, when an avoidant is pulling away, it is often a sign that they are feeling overwhelmed by the vulnerability and closeness that a deeper connection entails. Recognizing that the avoidance behavior comes from a place of fear can shift the perspective and how to handle the relationship dynamic. Instead of seeing their distance as an intentional act of avoidance or disregard, it can be viewed as a protective mechanism. The avoidant fears being consumed by their emotions, which leads them to pull away when they sense vulnerability creeping in. The fear is rooted in the belief that closeness will eventually lead to disappointment, and in order to prevent this from happening, they keep others at arm's length, whether consciously or unconsciously. This internal struggle can be draining for both the avoidant and their partner, as the push and pull creates an emotional roller coaster. By understanding that the avoidant's fear of emotional closeness is the primary driver of their behavior, it becomes possible to navigate the dynamic with more patience and strategic thinking. The key to making the avoidant anxious about your absence lies in recognizing the fine line between closeness and emotional overwhelm. The avoidance fear can be so intense that they may not even recognize the depth of their own feelings until they sense the possibility of losing someone. Creating emotional space in a relationship with an avoidant individual is one of the most powerful strategies for getting them to notice your absence. The key to making the avoidant anxious about your absence is not about playing games or manipulating them. Rather, it's about recognizing the inherent emotional dynamics at play and using them in a way that allows them to come to terms with their own vulnerability. Emotional space is critical because it introduces a void that allows the avoidant person to feel the impact of your presence in their life and forces them to confront their true feelings, something they may have been suppressing or avoiding. The first step in creating emotional space is recognizing the importance of boundaries. An avoidant person often has a deeply ingrained fear of losing their independence and being overwhelmed by someone else's emotional needs. If they sense that you are constantly available, emotionally or physically, they may take that for granted. The constant availability can inadvertently reduce the value of your presence because the avoidant person may begin to feel that you are predictable and always accessible, thus not creating a sense of emotional urgency. Emotional space, therefore, is about pulling back just enough to make the avoidant realize that you are not always there at their beck and call. The space doesn't mean cutting off all communication or disappearing completely, but it does mean creating a subtle but noticeable gap that draws their attention to the fact that your availability is not something they can rely on indefinitely. By creating emotional space, you allow the avoidant person to feel the absence of your energy, your attention, and your presence in their life. This absence can stir emotions they typically try to suppress, including fear, anxiety, and even longing. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, these emotions can be particularly difficult to process because they challenge their self-protective mechanisms. The avoidant has spent so much time and energy protecting themselves from emotional vulnerability that when they feel the absence of someone they care about, it can cause a deep sense of discomfort. This discomfort often leads to self-reflection, forcing the avoidant to question whether their behavior of emotional distance is worth the potential cost of losing the connection they once had. Emotional space, therefore, serves as a mirror reflecting back the significance of your presence in their life. Another critical aspect of creating emotional space is the practice of self-care and self-assertiveness. When you start to prioritize your own emotional needs and set boundaries around how much you give to the avoidant, you are essentially showing them that your time and energy are valuable. This is a direct contrast to their habitual sense of emotional self-sufficiency, which often involves keeping others at arm's length. By taking care of yourself, engaging in activities that bring you joy and fulfillment outside of the relationship, and focusing on your personal growth, you are sending a message that you are not solely dependent on the avoidant for your emotional well-being. This can create a subtle but powerful shift in how they perceive you. They may begin to see you not as someone who is endlessly available to meet their emotional needs, but as someone who has their own life, their own needs, and their own emotional boundaries. Creating emotional space also allows you to maintain a sense of mystery and intrigue in the relationship. When you're always available and constantly meeting the avoidant's emotional needs, they can start to take you for granted. However, when you step back, even just slightly, it adds a layer of complexity to the dynamic. The avoidant begins to wonder what you're doing when you're not around, whether you're still thinking about them, and how much they might be losing by keeping their distance. This uncertainty can create a natural anxiety in the avoidant, which may prompt them to reassess the relationship and their emotional availability. While the goal of creating emotional space is not to manipulate the avoidant, it is about striking a balance between closeness and independence. The avoidant needs to see that you are not solely focused on them and that you have your own life outside of the relationship. This creates a sense of urgency. When they perceive that they might lose you or that you might no longer be available to them, it can trigger feelings of anxiety. This anxiety is not a negative emotion, but rather a sign that the avoidant is beginning to recognize the value of your presence and is starting to experience the emotional cost of their own distance. By allowing the avoidant to feel the emotional void of your absence, you essentially put the ball in their court. They are now forced to confront their own emotions and make a decision about whether they want to close the gap or allow it to widen further. This approach doesn't involve forcing the avoidant to open up or behave in a certain way, but it does encourage them to reflect on the consequences of their actions and the emotional distance they've created. When you create emotional space with respect and intentionality, it gives the avoidant person the chance to feel the void that only you could fill, making them anxious about the possibility of losing that connection. Scarcity is a powerful principle in human behavior that influences how people perceive value. It's a psychological concept that operates on the belief that things become more valuable when they are rare or difficult to obtain. In relationships, this principle can be harnessed to make the avoidant person anxious about your absence without resorting to manipulation or playing games. The key is to introduce a sense of scarcity into the dynamic, making it clear that your time, attention, and emotional energy are not endlessly available. By doing so, you create an emotional gap that makes the avoidant person question whether they want to lose the connection they have with you. The first step in utilizing the concept of scarcity is to recognize that the avoidant person has a tendency to take others for granted, especially when it comes to emotional availability. Since they fear emotional dependence and vulnerability, they may unconsciously assume that others will always be there for them, even when they distance themselves. This can lead to a pattern of emotional disengagement on their part, where they expect you to always be there, waiting for them to open up or come back. However, when you begin to limit your emotional availability, you disrupt this assumption. You show them that you are not always going to be around when they need you and that you have your own life, your own priorities, and your own needs. Creating scarcity in your emotional availability doesn't mean cutting off all communication or becoming distant in a way that punishes the avoidant. It's not about playing games or making them feel abandoned. Instead, it's about pulling back just enough to make them realize that your time and energy are finite. The avoidant, who may be used to having you around whenever they need you, will begin to notice the absence when you step back. This absence will feel like a void to them, one that creates a sense of loss. It's the emotional equivalent of a valuable resource becoming harder to obtain. They will feel the need to reassess their behavior, and this can lead to increased emotional awareness and reflection on their part. The scarcity effect works because humans are wired to value what they cannot have or what is in short supply. Think about how people often become more interested in something when they think it might be taken away or is no longer readily available. This is the same principle at play in relationships. When you reduce your emotional availability, the avoidant person starts to feel the pressure of potentially losing someone who was once always there. This feeling of loss can trigger anxiety, making them realize that their usual emotional distance may have consequences. They may start to question whether their avoidance is worth the risk of losing you or the connection that they secretly desire but fear to embrace. In addition to creating emotional space, scarcity can also be applied through the way you interact with the avoidant. If you've been overly accommodating or constantly available, pulling back from this dynamic can create an emotional imbalance that shifts the power in the relationship. And when you stop giving so freely of your time, your attention, or your emotional energy, the avoidant person will feel the difference. They may begin to wonder why you're available as you once were, or why you're no longer putting in as much effort. This shift can lead them to question the stability of the relationship and whether their avoidance is preventing them from maintaining something they value. The more they feel that your presence is no longer a guarantee, the more likely they are to feel anxious about losing that presence. Another way to create scarcity is by introducing unpredictability into your interactions. If you've been consistently responsive and emotionally available, consider introducing periods where you are less predictable or take a step back. This could mean taking a little longer to respond to messages, being less available for immediate emotional support, or focusing more on your own needs and interests. This unpredictability serves to heighten the feeling of scarcity because the avoidant person will start to notice that they can't rely on you to always be there when they need you. The more you make your time and attention a rare commodity, the more it becomes something that they need to actively protect or pursue. It's important to remember that scarcity in relationships is not about playing hard to get or trying to create artificial tension. Instead, it's about shifting the dynamic so that the avoidant person is forced to acknowledge the value of your presence and the consequences of their emotional distance. When they sense that they might lose you, they will start to feel a sense of urgency that will lead to introspection and ultimately a reevaluation of their avoidance behaviors. This sense of scarcity doesn't force them to change, but simply makes them aware that the dynamic they have been maintaining is no longer sustainable without consequences. Ultimately, scarcity works because it taps into a fundamental aspect of human nature, the desire to preserve what is valuable. When you create the perception that your presence is not always guaranteed, the avoidant person may begin to feel the emotional weight of their own behavior. This can prompt them to consider whether their avoidance is worth the potential costs of losing something important to them. Scarcity, when used with intention and respect, can shift the emotional dynamic in a relationship, prompting the avoidant person to re-engage and reassess their emotional defenses. Maintaining self-worth is one of the most powerful ways to navigate any relationship, especially when dealing with an avoidant individual. It's crucial to recognize that your value does not hinge on how much you give to someone else, nor does it depend on how much they reciprocate. In the context of an avoidant relationship, maintaining your self-worth involves understanding your intrinsic value and not losing sight of it, regardless of how the avoidant person behaves. The avoidant's tendency to distance themselves emotionally can sometimes lead to feelings of insecurity or self-doubt for their partner, but it's vital to remember that their avoidance is not a reflection of your worth or the quality of the connection you share. It is a manifestation of their own fears and unresolved emotional issues. One of the challenges in relationships with avoidants is the tendency to fall into the role of constantly accommodating their emotional needs, or in some cases, suppressing your own needs in order to avoid conflict or rejection. The avoidant person's fear of intimacy and emotional vulnerability can make them withdraw at times when closeness is required, leaving you feeling neglected or undervalued. However, in these moments, it's crucial to resist the temptation to chase after their approval or to give up your own needs to gain their attention. Doing so only erodes your self-worth and feeds into the avoidance pattern of emotional disengagement. Instead, it's important to maintain a healthy sense of self-worth even when faced with the challenges of emotional distance. When you recognize your value as a person, independent of someone else's behavior, you create a foundation for a more balanced relationship dynamic. By maintaining your self-worth, you communicate to the avoidant that you have your own needs and boundaries that deserve respect. You aren't a source of validation for their behavior, nor are you someone who will continuously tolerate emotional distance. Your self-worth is rooted in the understanding that you deserve to be treated with respect, empathy, and care, just like anyone else. When you demonstrate that you are not willing to sacrifice your emotional well-being for the sake of someone else's comfort, you set a clear standard for how you expect to be treated. This doesn't mean becoming distant or withholding love and affection as a way to punish the avoidant, but rather recognizing that your own emotional health and boundaries are non-negotiable. You are not simply a passive participant in the relationship. You are an active, deserving partner who deserves reciprocation and respect. When you maintain your self-worth, it becomes a powerful tool to counteract the avoidance emotional distance. Instead of getting caught in a cycle of chasing after their affection or approval, you create a healthy space for the relationship to develop at a pace that is comfortable for both parties. You also make it clear that you are not dependent on their approval to feel valued. This shift in mindset is incredibly powerful because it changes the dynamics of the relationship. The avoidant person who is used to keeping emotional distance and avoiding vulnerability will begin to realize that they can no longer take you for granted. When they see that you are standing firm in your own worth, they may start to feel the emotional void created by your absence, triggering them to reconsider their distance. The act of maintaining self-worth is not about being rigid or inflexible. Rather, it's about having a clear understanding of your own needs and ensuring that those needs are met. It's also about practicing self-compassion and recognizing that you are deserving of love, attention, and connection. For the avoidant, who often has a tendency to dismiss or downplay their own emotional needs, your unwavering commitment to your own emotional health can be a powerful mirror. It shows them that vulnerability and emotional intimacy are not something to be feared or avoided, but something that can be navigated with respect and boundaries. By modeling healthy self-worth, you provide the avoidant with an example of how they can begin to embrace their own emotional needs without fear of losing their independence. Another important aspect of maintaining self-worth is recognizing that the avoidant emotional distance is not something you can control. Their withdrawal is a reflection of their own internal struggles, not a reflection of your inability to meet their needs. It's easy to internalize their behavior, thinking that it's your fault or that you're not doing enough. But this mindset only leads to feelings of inadequacy and frustration. By maintaining your self-worth, you shift the focus from trying to fix the avoidance behavior to taking responsibility for your own emotional health. This shift not only empowers you, but also allows you to respond to the avoidance emotional distance in a way that is grounded in self-respect rather than desperation. In relationships with avoidance, maintaining self-worth is an ongoing practice. It requires constant self-reflection, setting boundaries, and being mindful of your emotional needs. It also means letting go of the need for constant validation from the avoidant and recognizing that you have the right to be loved and cared for in a way that feels fulfilling and reciprocal. When you operate from a place of self-worth, you send a message to the avoidant that you are not someone to be taken for granted. Your value is inherent and your emotional health is worth protecting. This, in turn, can encourage the avoidant to recognize their own emotional needs and reconsider their distancing behaviors. Setting healthy boundaries is a cornerstone of any relationship, but it becomes especially crucial when interacting with an avoidant individual. For those with avoidant attachment styles, emotional closeness often triggers fear and anxiety, leading them to withdraw or distance themselves when they feel vulnerable. However, this withdrawal doesn't mean that they don't care or that the relationship is not important to them. Instead, it's often a defense mechanism to protect themselves from emotional overwhelm. This is where healthy boundaries come into play. They create the emotional space necessary for both partners to feel respected, understood, and valued without compromising their emotional well-being. When dealing with avoidance, it's easy to fall into the trap of over-accommodating their need for space. Since avoidants fear intimacy, they may unintentionally push their partner away either physically or emotionally when they feel too close. However, if you constantly allow them to dictate the pace of the relationship, it can lead to frustration, neglect, and feelings of emotional insufficiency. This is why setting boundaries is vital, not to punish the avoidant, but to create a framework in which both parties can operate with mutual respect and understanding. Setting boundaries sends a clear message that your emotional needs are just as important as theirs and that you're not willing to sacrifice your own well-being for the sake of their comfort. The process of setting healthy boundaries with an avoidant individual involves being clear and consistent about your own emotional limits. Avoidants often struggle with reading emotional cues, and as a result, they may unintentionally overlook the signs that their behavior is hurting you. If you don't vocalize your boundaries, the avoidant may not realize that their actions are causing harm. This is not to say that you should be confrontational or aggressive in setting boundaries, but rather that you communicate openly and assertively about your needs and limitations. For example, if the avoidant person has a habit of withdrawing or going silent when things get too emotionally intense, you might need to express that while you understand their need for space, it's not acceptable for them to shut you out completely without any explanation. By calmly stating that this behavior is not conducive to a healthy relationship, you set a boundary that protects your emotional health. Moreover, setting boundaries isn't just about communicating what you won't tolerate, it's also about defining what you do need in the relationship. For example, if you require more emotional engagement or quality time together, it's important to express this need in a way that is respectful of both your feelings and the avoidant's limitations. Often, avoidants are afraid that their partner's needs will overwhelm them, so it's important to reassure them that your need for closeness is not about demanding constant attention or emotional labor. Instead, it's about creating a healthy and balanced dynamic in which both partners feel heard and valued. A critical aspect of setting boundaries with avoidance is consistency. If you set a boundary, but fail to enforce it when it's crossed, the avoidant may view it as flexible or negotiable. This can lead to frustration and confusion both for you and for them. For instance, if you've established that you need more communication or emotional transparency, but the avoidant person repeatedly avoids or dismisses these conversations, it's important to reinforce the boundary without becoming punitive. Reinforcement might look like calmly reminding them of your needs or taking a step back emotionally when they violate the boundary. Over time, this consistency teaches the avoidant that there are consequences for emotional distance or avoidance, which can lead to a deeper understanding of the relationship's needs. One of the challenges in setting boundaries with avoidance is their tendency to pull away when they feel overwhelmed. While this withdrawal is often a natural coping mechanism for them, it can be damaging if it leads to prolonged emotional disengagement. In these moments, it's important to recognize that the avoidant may not be intentionally trying to hurt you. They may be feeling overwhelmed by their own emotions and the intensity of the connection. However, this doesn't excuse neglect or withdrawal without explanation. By setting boundaries around how much emotional distance is acceptable, you create a clear framework for the avoidant to understand that while you respect their need for space, you also need emotional connection in the relationship. In addition to setting boundaries, it's essential to model healthy emotional regulation and respect for your own needs. When you enforce boundaries, you're not just setting limits for the other person, you're also demonstrating how to care for yourself emotionally. When you prioritize your own well-being, the avoidant may begin to understand that their withdrawal has consequences not just for you, but for the relationship as a whole. By maintaining your boundaries and taking care of yourself, you encourage the avoidant to reflect on their behavior and reconsider whether their emotional distance is worth the potential cost of losing the relationship. Ultimately, setting healthy boundaries is an essential step in creating a balanced and fulfilling relationship with an avoidant individual. It's not about controlling their behavior, but rather about protecting your own emotional needs and ensuring that both partners can coexist in a way that feels respectful, healthy, and sustainable. When boundaries are set and respected, the avoidant person may begin to feel the emotional impact of their distance and realize that the relationship requires more vulnerability and emotional engagement to thrive. By reinforcing these boundaries with empathy, consistency, and respect, you can create a space where both you and the avoidant feel safe to express your feelings and needs, fostering a deeper connection over time. The art of emotional self-regulation is one of the most crucial skills you can develop, especially when navigating relationships with an avoidant individual. People with avoidant attachment styles often struggle with emotional intimacy, and they may withdraw when they feel overwhelmed or vulnerable. For those in relationships with avoidance, emotional self-regulation is essential not only for personal well-being, but also for maintaining a healthy balance in the relationship. The goal is not to suppress your emotions or deny your needs, but to manage them in a way that ensures your emotional health while also allowing the relationship to grow without adding unnecessary stress or pressure. When you're dealing with an avoidant, their emotional withdrawal or reluctance to engage can be triggering. It may leave you feeling frustrated, hurt, or neglected, and without the proper tools for emotional self-regulation, these feelings can escalate into conflict or emotional burnout. Emotional self-regulation involves recognizing your emotions, understanding them, and then responding to them in a way that is thoughtful, measured, and healthy. This means acknowledging your feelings of hurt or disappointment without allowing them to control your actions or influence your decisions in the relationship. When you can regulate your emotions, you prevent reactive behaviors that may push the avoidant further away, which can often happen if emotions are not managed properly. The first step in emotional self-regulation is developing self-awareness. This means paying attention to your emotional triggers and understanding why certain behaviors from the avoidant partner might affect you more deeply than others. For instance, when the avoidant pulls away, you may experience feelings of rejection or fear of abandonment. Understanding these feelings allows you to address them in a more constructive way. Instead of reacting impulsively by becoming anxious, needy, or distant, you can pause and reflect on why you feel the way you do. This pause is essential because it helps you recognize that your emotional responses are often a reflection of your own needs and fears rather than an immediate reaction to your partner's behavior. By gaining clarity around your emotions, you become better equipped to respond in a calm and grounded way, reducing the likelihood of emotional escalation. Once you have developed self-awareness, the next step is practicing emotional regulation through mindfulness. Mindfulness involves being present in the moment without judgment, which allows you to observe your emotions without becoming overwhelmed by them. When an avoidant partner withdraws or becomes emotionally distant, mindfulness helps you to detach from the initial emotional reaction and approach the situation with more objectivity. Instead of spiraling into anxiety or frustration, mindfulness helps you to create emotional space between your feelings and your actions. This gives you the mental clarity to assess the situation more rationally without letting fear or insecurity dictate your behavior. A key component of emotional self-regulation is learning how to respond, not react to your emotions. Reactions are often impulsive and driven by underlying fears or unmet needs, whereas responses are intentional and measured. In a relationship with an avoidant person, there may be times when you feel the urge to act on your emotions, whether it's through seeking constant reassurance, becoming angry, or withdrawing yourself to protect your own heart. However, responding in these ways often leads to an unhealthy cycle of emotional push and pull that only deepens the emotional distance. Instead of reacting impulsively, practicing emotional self-regulation means taking a step back, processing your feelings, and considering what a constructive response would look like. For example, if the avoidant becomes distant, you may want to communicate how their behavior makes you feel without demanding or pressuring them to change immediately. This approach helps to maintain the emotional balance of the relationship, allowing space for both individuals to express their feelings without the pressure of feeling overwhelmed. Another important aspect of emotional self-regulation is learning how to manage your expectations. People with avoidant attachment styles may not always be able to meet your emotional needs in the way you want or expect. They may struggle with expressing vulnerability or giving emotional support in times of need, and this can be frustrating for their partners. However, managing your expectations can help prevent disappointment and frustration. By understanding that the avoidant may need time and space to process their emotions before they are ready to engage fully, you can adjust your expectations accordingly. This doesn't mean lowering your standards or accepting unhealthy behavior, but it does mean being realistic about what the avoidant is capable of offering at any given moment. Learning to accept the relationship for what it is, rather than constantly hoping for what it could be, helps you maintain emotional stability and prevents unnecessary stress. In conclusion, understanding and managing the dynamics of a relationship with an avoidant individual requires a delicate balance of self-awareness, emotional regulation, and setting healthy boundaries. By creating emotional space, maintaining your self-worth, and responding thoughtfully to their withdrawal, you create an environment where both you and the avoidant can thrive. Remember, the goal isn't to manipulate or control, but to foster a space where both partners can grow while respecting each other's emotional needs. I thank you for your attention and commitment to exploring this topic, and I hope this speech empowers you to build stronger, healthier relationships grounded in self-respect, understanding, and emotional balance.